Tensions between the US and China have been steadily escalating as they spar on everything from democracy in Hong Kong to the data security of TikTok. But there's one place where a military battle between the superpowers is most likely to happen: the South China Sea. What started as a territorial dispute over rocks and reefs grew into clashes over fishing and natural resources. Now, the South China Sea is home to escalating war games between two of the world's largest militaries.
I think we're getting to a point now where confrontation is more likely.
Recent tensions have threatened to boil over.
It used to be in the old days that the Americans were clearly the superpower. They could sail where they wanted and nobody else could do anything about it. Whereas now I think the Chinese are starting to think that maybe they have the military power, the weapons that could actually threaten the Americans.
As Joe Biden comes into office, this is an issue that's not going to get any easier to solve because China sees it as part of its very core strategic interest to control that territory. That's not going to change whoever is in the White House.
We're at a kind of dangerous phase at the moment and looks set to continue.
So how did an East Asian dispute over a group of small islands become a significant flashpoint for U.S. China relations? The South China Sea encompasses 1.4 million square miles, making it almost 1.5 times bigger than the Mediterranean Sea. It's a key commercial gateway that sees 1/3 of the world's maritime shipping pass through it every year, accounting for more than $3 trillion in trade. Beneath the surface, the maritime life is vital to the diets and economies of the surrounding nations. Around 12% of the global fish catch comes from these waters, which also hosts more than half of the world's fishing vessels. Even further down, beneath the seabed, is the promise of natural gas and crude oil reserves. The exact amount is disputed, with both the US and China giving vastly different estimates. The US estimates that the sea holds about 190 trillion cubic feet of natural gas and 11 billion barrels of oil.
South China Sea, it's a strategic crossroads, really. It links on one side the Pacific and the other side the Indian Ocean, and then north to China and south to Australia. Huge amounts of world trade go through, huge amounts of oil. Most of the things that we buy in the shops that come out of China, Japan, Taiwan, all travel through the South China Sea.
For decades, China and neighbouring Southeast Asian nations have disputed territorial claims within the area, largely centred around two groups of islands: the Spratly Islands in the south and the Paracel Islands in the north.
It's a point of contention because there are two kinds of disputes. There are disputes about the islands, who owns them, but they overlap with disputes about what you can do in the sea, whose rules apply, and they also overlap with this great power competition between China and the US. So it's this intersection of these three layers of disputes. That's what makes the situation so dangerous.
Brunei, Malaysia, the Philippines, Taiwan, and Vietnam all have claims in the region, but it's China's claims that are the most contentious. China claimed more than 80% of the South China Sea, referring to a map from 1947 that shows a U-shaped line looping down to a point about 1,100 miles or 1,800 kilometers south of its Hainan Island.
China's claim in the South China Sea emerged between 1907 and 1947, in those 40 years. And it really emerged in the context of China struggling against foreign powers in the first half of the 20th century. Against Japan, and then later against France, and then against Japan again during the Second World War. It became an emotional question. It became a time when China wanted to stand up against the world, and one way of doing that was by staking a claim to territory.
But Beijing didn't start actively asserting this claim until later in the 20th century.
It's really when oil gets discovered in certain parts of the South China Sea in the late 1960s, early 1970s, that's when it starts to heat up a bit more, and you start to see more of the islands being occupied. Philippines moves in the 70s, the Vietnamese also do the same thing, and then the Malaysians get in the game. The Chinese government doesn't make its first occupations actually physically planting the flag in the Spratly Islands until 1988, so they come very late to the game at that point.
In the years that followed, nations jostled among themselves for control of the islands, but since the mid-1990s, the occupation of most parts of the Spratly and Paracel Islands hadn't changed significantly. But as China's position on the world stage grew, so too did their activity in the region.
In the Chinese telling of how this spat began, China says, back in the early 2000s, China and the Southeast Asian nations who also have claims there got along fine. And what really kicked off the conflict was when, during the early days of the Obama administration, they had this pivot to Asia. And so when the U.S. did this pivot to Asia, it sort of encouraged a lot of the Southeast Asian nations to start exerting their claims in the South China Sea, to start building on islands that they had occupied. And so then China, by Beijing's telling, felt compelled to do the same and to do it to a greater degree.
I think there have been two major changing points in recent years. So there's the 2008 financial crisis, when the American economy goes into a nosedive. At the same time, you have the Beijing Olympics, when China suddenly appears on the world stage. And you get a new confidence in China that maybe their way is superior to the American way of running the world. And I think that then leads into the selection of President Xi in 2012 by the Communist Party as their party leader.
China's once-in-a-decade transition of power was completed earlier today.
Xi Jinping, head of the Chinese Communist Party, has just been elected president of China in a near-unanimous vote.
Before Xi becomes party leader in 2012, you notice in the South China Sea different bits of the state, the Coast Guard, the Navy, the fishing protection, the police or whatever, all following different policies. From 2013 onwards, once Xi's in power, you see much more centralized control. And that's in 2013 when you start to see China building these massive artificial islands in the Spratly Islands with huge military bases on them.
We continue our look this morning at what China does not want you to see. The United States says the superpower is reclaiming land in the South China Sea.
China has begun this campaign of building islands in the South China Sea, taking reefs and rocks and building on top of that with sand and filling in the water. And on top of that land, they've built airstrips. They've put missiles in. They've put in installments where military personnel can be there full time.
Beijing transformed the disputed reefs and rocks by reclaiming 670 acres of land from the sea to create islands with administrative buildings, hospitals, and sport complexes. There's also runways that can land fighter jets and are equipped with defensive systems, radar antennae, and radio systems, which are intended to monitor the area around them. China's use of the islands in this way prevents other countries developing resources, and that directly breaches the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, also known as UNCLOS. UNCLOS was established in 1982, and it states that a country can have a territorial zone of 12 nautical miles off its coast, a further 12 nautical miles where it has limited controls, and an exclusive economic zone of 200 nautical miles. China argues that the Paracel and Spratly Islands are part of its territory, and therefore they own anything within those exclusive economic zones, be it fish or natural resources, and it's been enforcing this in increasingly hostile ways.
China's general military philosophy is something called active defense, when the idea is to appear to be non-threatening and to be defensive, but to create situations where you lure the opponent into making a move, which then allows you to respond in force and in full.
Philippine military aircraft, I'm warning you again. Leave immediately, or you will bear forward responsibility for all the consequences.
So what it's doing now is using these islands as a means of projecting power. So it's successfully intimidated Vietnam and stopped it developing its offshore oil and gas reserves. It's done the same thing to the Philippines. It's tried to do the same thing with Malaysia, but with less success. China, in effect, has established a kind of a block on the other countries developing their maritime resources. I suppose the next thing that might happen will be that then China might try and use its force to develop resources which it doesn't have a claim to under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea.
In 2016, an international tribunal in The Hague ruled that the Paracel and Spratlys were rocks rather than islands, and therefore would not get the benefits of EEZs. The ruling also stated that there was no legal basis for China's claims.
And what that meant was that suddenly the value of the disputed islands became much less in theory, because it meant you couldn't claim huge amounts of resources, oil and gas and fish from around them. However, China has refused to recognize this ruling, and the reason is obvious, is that it actually diminishes the value of these disputed islands and makes the case for the surrounding countries, Vietnam, Malaysia, Philippines, Brunei, much, much stronger for the resources, for the oil and the gas and the fish.
Diplomats in China and ASEAN countries have turned their attention to an earlier legally binding document in the hope of a resolution.
The ASEAN nations and China said to have reached an agreement to begin negotiations on a code of conduct in the South China Sea.
Unfortunately, the long-term outlook is not good. The fact is that you have a negotiation process between ASEAN and China that is not really going very well. They're trying to establish a code of conduct that would set some parameters for how business is conducted in the South China Sea. At the same time, however, they don't actually address the dispute at all. So no dispute resolution mechanisms are really being negotiated seriously at this time. What's perhaps more concerning is the ever-evolving China-US competition dynamic, which is becoming more aggressive in nature.
The US's response in the South China Sea has been mainly driven from its sort of overall strategic interests, because the South China Sea connects America's west coast from California to the Indian Ocean and to the Middle East, and so they see it as a vital strategic corridor for them, for civilian shipping but also military shipping to go through.
During the Obama administration, the issue was very contentious already. And so when Trump came in, what really happened was not that the conflict arose, but the way that the US government began to pursue its strategy became much more aggressive, became much more proactive and abrasive. That's why the situation in the South China Sea has become much more dangerous.
A US presence has been increasing in the region since 2012. Over the years, administrations have waded in on arguments over resources, but haven't taken sides in the territorial disputes until now.
Beijing doesn't respect the fundamental democratic values or those enshrined in the ASEAN Charter.
Previous years, we've seen a lot of positive language from regional partners who wish to make room for China as a global superpower. But China's come on a little hard.
The US has issued one of its strongest warnings against China over Beijing's illegal territorial claims in the South China Sea.
It's not China's maritime empire. The United States is prepared to do the things necessary to assist them in protecting their valid legal claims.
Expansion of the Chinese Navy has become one of the latest concerns for US and ASEAN nations. Beijing's anti-ship ballistic missiles are also known as carrier killers. A Department of Defense report suggests that China may be the first ever to attach this category of weapon to a warship.
There's a good reason to think that a lot of China's activities in the South China Sea in terms of building up its bases are done with a possible invasion of Taiwan in mind. They're thinking that if there was ever an invasion, an attempt to forcibly bring Taiwan into the People's Republic of China, that the United States would try and defend Taiwan. And having these islands there with missiles already on them and runways and so forth would be a way of keeping the Americans at bay. It's also, I think, part of trying to create a bastion, a hiding place for their ballistic missile submarines there, and a way of just keeping the Americans away from their southern coast. Both China and the US regard the South China Sea as pretty crucial to their overall strategic interests, which means they're going to struggle hard.
The escalation of military activities in the South China Sea, even in the midst of a pandemic, has many onlookers concerned. A war of words on Twitter and state TV has transformed into warships and military drills that could be the start of a new Cold War.
In the final waning days of the Trump administration, you've seen a slew of measures taken. And I think a lot of those measures have been taken to try and prevent Joe Biden's administration from coming in and undoing a lot of what President Trump had put into place during his time in office. Based on what we've heard from the Biden administration, it does seem that the strategy will be to work more closely with allies. If the Biden administration is able to form a united front as it comes to the South China Sea, I think two things could happen. If it becomes an alliance against China, I think you will see the Chinese become more aggressive in pushing back on that. The alternative would be some sort of more inclusive alliance that wants to welcome China into the fold. And if that is something that happens, I think you could see a much more benign resolution to the problem. Obviously, there are a lot of things going on in the United States. I don't think the South China Sea is particularly high on Joe Biden's priority list at the moment. But I think in the future, in the next couple of years, that is what will start to develop.